What's happening, folks? Back with the next piece in the second day of our Classical Days series. Thank you to everyone who's been following along so far. And we're going to listen to a symphony from Joseph Haydn, one of the Viennese masters, a world-famous composer, and ultimately the grandfather of the modern four-movement symphony form, as well as the developer of the string quartet and the piano trio. So a very prolific composer, more on that in a moment, a writer of incredible melodies, and a developer of many of the modern standards of classical music composition. So he is indeed an Austrian composer. I think he was born in a small town called Rohrau. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. He grew up in a relatively humble family. I think his father was like a wheel maker, but his father was also a folk musician who taught Joseph how to play the harp. Eventually, Joseph found his way to Wien, or Vienna, and after a time, he became the Kapellmeister, which is to say the lead composer and conductor in the imperial court. And later in his life, and arranged or assisted by someone with the surname Salomon, he spent time in England, specifically in London, during which time he wrote his final 12 symphonies, including the one we're going to hear here, the 104th. That's right, you heard me correctly, 104. He was, again, a very prolific composer. Now, the 12 symphonies that he wrote while in England are collectively referred to as the London Symphonies, but this final symphony he wrote, the 104th, is even more narrowly called the London Symphony, though in Germany my understanding is that it's known as the Salomon Symphony because of the individual who helped his tour and residency in England. In any case, it's in D major. It is part of a 5-disc, I think, compilation from Deutsche Grammophon from 2003, performed by the London Philharmonic Orchestra and conducted by Eugen Jochum, I think. Is it Jochum? I think it's Jochum. In any case, this is not to be confused with a 1993 Deutsche Grammophon compilation of the 12 London Symphonies. So just to be clear, this is the 2003 recording. And the opening movement, I think it's an Allegro Adagio, or is it Adagio Allegro? Make sure I have this correct. It is an Adagio Allegro. So yes, I like all four movements, and I have to say, I heard this going back to my youth because my dad, which once again, that's where my love of classical music came from. My dad was always playing it when I was growing up, and I became very interested in different composers. He had a CD which had this symphony as well as a couple others from the London Symphonies, the Military Symphony and the Clock Symphony, and the latter of which is another one of his most famous. But I didn't pay it too much heed. I enjoyed it, but again, I keyed in on Beethoven and Mozart and some other composers more. But when I saw Nota Me Cantabile in the mid-2000s, I became a much bigger fan of this piece. And once again, even if you're not into Japanese television drama, if you do enjoy classical music, I highly encourage you to check out the show. I'll put a link to my full watch-along of it in the description here. It's a show about 2 university music students, as well as a number of others around them, who are on the verge of becoming professional, and later in the series, they spend time in Europe, and one of the 2 main characters, Chiaki, is studying to be a conductor, and he ends up performing this symphony in a conducting tournament or competition. So yes, through that show and the great scene in which this symphony is performed, I became a much bigger fan of this work. So, as I said, the first movement is an Adagio Allegro, and as I said, the symphony overall is in D major. Let's give it a listen. This is the first movement of Joseph Haydn's 104th Symphony, which is sometimes called the London Symphony, and the opening movement is an Adagio Allegro. Amazing. Definitely a very beautiful movement. It does have a very heavy beginning, and there's sections where it has a mixed sort of emotional sound. But by and large, it has a bright feel to it, and the strings are perhaps the most prominent element, but the horns are definitely heard in crucial moments. There's a couple sections where the woodwinds stand out, but yes, I would say mostly it's a string dominated movement. I think I forgot to mention this is from 1795, and you can hear that late classical period sound. He was a contemporary of people like Mozart, and you definitely can hear in the string writing, I think in particular, some similarities, and of course they're both a couple of the Viennese masters. So yes, this is, I think, a great opening. My favorite movement is probably the fourth. We'll get there. I'm going to go through the whole symphony, of course, but I think this is a lovely beginning to a beautiful symphony. Let me know what you think, and I will see you for the next movement. Peace.